Samuel Houston was born in Rockbridge County, Virginia on March 2nd of 1793. His father's name was also Samuel Houston, making Sam a junior. His mother was Elizabeth Paxton. Together, this couple would have 9 children. Money was always a tight issue when considering that you had to feed these 9 children, so the Houston family planned to sell their land and join the Frontiersmen in Tennessee to try to scrape out a better living there. In 1806, these plans would need to be put on the back burner when Sam Houston Sr. unfortunately passed away. This only paused the Houston family, though, who continued the process of selling their land in Virginia for new, cheaper land in Tennessee. With help from her children, Elizabeth Houston then set up a small farm near Maryville, Tennessee, a small town where the Houston family kids would run a little store. In his early life, Sam Houston could be described as something of an outcast. As a teenager, he would explore the edges of the frontiers, alone, perhaps encountering the local Cherokee tribes that lived just on the peripheries of America. Sam did not even believe in his family's Presbyterian Christianity, and like all good outcasts, Sam rejected most of his schooling in an effort to self-educate himself. He read books from his father's library, like Jedediah Morse, the father of Samuel Morse, the later inventor of the telegraph. Jedediah Morse, on the other hand, was a famous American geographer, which makes complete sense when considering how much Sam loved to explore the frontiers of America. When Sam was only 16, he decided to join another group who were viewed as an outcast by other Americans. So he ran away from home in 1809 and went to Hiawatha Island, which was located at the conflux of the Tennessee and Hiawatha rivers. On this island, a Cherokee tribe of Native Americans accepted the 16-year-old boy as one of their own. The chief of this tribe was named Chief Jolly, and eventually Sam would learn the Cherokee language and be fully integrated into the tribe with his own Cherokee name, Raven. Sam would live the life of a Cherokee Indian for 3 years, until 1812, when he returned to Maryville, Tennessee as a much more rugged and experienced 19-year-old man. Then, Sam must have had a change of heart about education and religion, as he attended the Western Theological Seminary, where he was taught by its founder, Isaac Anderson. The adventurous spirit of Sam Houston could only be quelled for a short time. He had found another opportunity in 1812, specifically in the War of 1812. This war pitted the new United States of America against its old colonial owner, the British. In 1813, he joined the 39th Infantry Regiment, where he impressed the Lieutenant Colonel, Thomas Benton, who quickly promoted the 20-year-old Sam Houston to 3rd Lieutenant. By 1814, this regiment was assigned under the command of General Andrew Jackson, a man who can be described as an opposite to Houston in the department of feelings towards Native Americans. This can be seen as the only reason why he joined Andrew Jackson's regiment was due to a new war that had started with a group of Native Americans known as the Red Stick Creeks. Lieutenant Houston would find himself in a favorable spot, though, as his Cherokee brethren would help Andrew Jackson in this war. The multilingual Houston probably spent ample time in this war conversing with Cherokee Indians. After all, he was one of them. In 1814, after a few months of being in Jackson's army, Houston would find himself in the thick of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. By the end of the battle, 800 of the 1,000 Cherokee warriors lay dead. Only 47 Americans would find themselves in that same position, and 159 Americans would be wounded, with Sam Houston being among them. He was wounded badly, and many doctors saw little hope for the 20-year-old lieutenant. Miraculously, though, he survived, and returned to Maryville to heal from his wounds. While he was healing, Houston would earn the rank of 2nd lieutenant for the bravery that he had shown. In 1817, a few years after the end of the War of 1812, General Jackson would give Houston a job that would test the allegiances and beliefs of him. Jackson assigned him to remove the Cherokee from eastern Tennessee. This made sense as Houston tried to relieve the worries of his fellow Cherokee. Houston would dress in traditional native clothing when talking to the Cherokees. Raven, as he was called by the natives, showed up to the wrong meeting. He was still dressed in his native attire when meeting with the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. This big bird-looking, pro-slavery believing piece of plantation-owning garbage is one of the worst American politicians of all time, which is why it makes me very happy that Sam Houston hated him. After showing up to the meeting, John Calhoun reprimanded him for being too pro-Cherokee. He probably was, after all, and the next thing that he did would prove that even more. Sam joined the Cherokee in 1818 after he resigned from the army to help them by resettling in Arkansas. Arkansas happened to share a border with the neighboring province of Texas that was currently revolting. The Mexican War of Independence for Spain was in full swing, and they would fully gain that independence by 1821. After helping the resettling Cherokee, Sam would return to Tennessee, this time going to the up-and-coming city of Nashville. In Nashville, Sam blazed through law school, finishing it in under a year, and opened his own law practice in 1819 near Lebanon, Tennessee. The charismatic and loved Houston was then, in a flurry, appointed to the District Attorney of Nashville and Major General of the Tennessee Militia. Tennessee was also home to another influential American, Andrew Jackson, These two wartime buddies would also join the same political party, the early Democratic Party that was newly founded by Martin Van Buren. With backing from Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston ran nearly unopposed as a member of the Tennessee House of Representatives. Of course, he would win this in 1823 and joined his fellow representatives in Washington, D.C. Uniquely, his first speech addressing the House would be to support the nation of Greece, who was currently revolting and fighting for their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Sam would eventually repay the backing that Jackson had gave him and advocate for Andrew Jackson in his 1824 presidential campaign that he would lose to John Quincy Adams. The mutual respect that Houston and Jackson shared for one another would once again be shown in 1827. Jackson would then support Samuel Houston in the election for the governor of Tennessee. As governor, Houston would support the infrastructure of Tennessee by connecting the many rivers of Tennessee with the construction of canals. As governor, he returned the favor once again to General Jackson in the 1828 presidential election. This election would see the first Democratic president win, with Andrew Jackson winning the majority of votes. A year later in 1829, the 36-year-old Houston decided to settle down and marry Eliza Ann in January of 1829. This would only last 3 months, as it was rumored that Eliza Allen was in love with a different man. This devastated Houston, who couldn't take the new, complicated, and divorced hole that he found himself in. Houston longed for an escape, away from the deceitful politicians of Tennessee and away from his divorce. So, Sam resigned as governor, donned his old Native American clothes, and took back his other name, Raven. Raven then set off to join with the Cherokee, who he had helped to resettle in Arkansas. 1829 was a bad year to do this, though. Houston's old wartime and political friend Andrew Jackson would start to show his true colors. His anti-Indian stance would culminate again, when he ordered for the removal of the Cherokees once again. But he didn't just order for the Cherokees to remove themselves from American land. No, he ordered for the removal of thousands of Indians from as far away as Michigan to the Seminoles of Florida. The 1830 Indian Removal Act would see these natives all join together in mostly what is the modern-day state of Oklahoma. Sam Houston tried to alleviate the stress of his Cherokee brethren by going to Washington, D.C. to try to gift the Cherokees with food rations on their westward journey. This would fail, and thousands of Cherokees would die on the Trail of Tears due to hypothermia and starvation. Houston would find himself in D.C. again in 1832. This time, a congressman named William Stanberry accused Houston of illegal collusion with the Jackson administration. Houston would write to Stanberry multiple times, and every time he would get no response. Having been fed up with politicians and Andrew Jackson's anti-Indian policies, Sam Houston snapped. Houston would end up beating Stanberry with a cane for his trash-talking nature. Sam was left satisfied by this, but the U.S. government was not amused. They brought him to a trial in the House of Representatives. Here, Houston would once again be reprimanded by the U.S. government. By a surprisingly close vote of 106 to 89, Houston lost and was forced to pay $500. What Houston wanted now was a new path in life. So he joined the hundreds of Americans who had began settling in the Mexican province of Texas. The Mexican government, for a while now, had started to invite Americans like Stephen Austin to settle in their sparsely populated territory. In December of 1832, Houston found himself in this Mexican territory. Sam was appointed to represent Nacogdoches at the Texan 1833 convention that tried to convince Mexico to make Texas one of their states. Mexico would refuse, and by 1834, President Santa Anna captured and arrested the Texan leader, Stephen Austin. It didn't take long after this for the American settlers in Texas to revolt against their Mexican government. Just a year later in 1835, Sam Houston became Major General Sam Houston, the highest-ranking officer in the hastily assembled Texan army. In 1836, Texas officially became their own country. Modeled after America, they became the Republic of Texas. Soon after this, the Alamo would come under siege, and Major General Houston tried to send soldiers to the little makeshift fort, but they were too late. Is there even a successful Texan revolution without the martyrdom of the Alamo, though? After all, the trademark saying of the Texan revolutionaries is, "Remember the Alamo." Later, in the year of 1836, Santa Anna caught up with Houston's force of 783 men and trapped them in the confines of a marshy swamp. This might have been the plan after all, as the Mexican soldiers, reassured by their soon-to-be victory, stayed and camped on the outskirts of the swamp. This mistake would give Houston an opportunity to sneak attack the Mexican camp and eventually capture Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. The Texans only agreed to release Santa Anna after he agreed to make peace with the newly formed Republic of Texas. Houston would receive another battle wound. This time his ankle was shattered, and he would be forced back to America for medical treatment. Upon returning to Texas later in 1836, Houston would run to be the first president of Texas. Samuel Houston would win this election and take office on October 22nd of 1836. Becoming the first president meant that Sam had a lot of work cut out for him. Houston was forced to deal with the debt that Texas had incurred during their revolution. Sam Houston also wanted to join the United States, but he was refused by his friend Andrew Jackson. Jackson did not want to unbalance the slave and non-slave states, so he did not agree to the Texan annexation. But he did try to help his old friend. At the end of Jackson's second term, his last decision as president was to recognize the Republic of Texas as a true country, which was definitely a step forward. Houston wanted to regain good relations with Mexico, and was unsurprisingly pro-Indian. Well, that is until his buttons were pushed. In 1838, the Cordova Rebellion would start. When Sam Houston heard of this in his new capital city of Houston, that was named after himself, he sent the Texas Rangers to deal with it. Sam had created this self-supplying military force so that he could cut back on military spending to try to pay off the Texan debt. The Rangers would put down the Cordova Rebellion, which was a Mexican-fueled attempt to win back Texas with help from local Kickapoo Indians. For Cherokee natives, he tried to gain alliances and give them favorable treaties, which was widely unpopular in Texas. Sam Houston was even progressive enough to support the end of Texan slavery, but this too was unpopular in Texas. In 1838, Houston would leave office, and in his place, Maribel B. Lamar would be selected as the second president of Texas. We already went over the early life of Sam Houston in this video linked here, so let's go over the next few years. Let's start where we left off with Sam. It's the end of Sam's first term as president of Texas. A rule in the Texas Constitution stipulates that a president cannot run for consecutive terms. So Samuel Houston is forced to stand by while his former vice president takes the presidency in a landslide election. Houston knows that his former VP, Maribel Bonaparte Lamar, will force away almost all of this hard work that he had accomplished in his presidency. So Samuel Houston makes sure to leave him a little something in his farewell address. Sam then goes on a 3-hour-long speech, invigorating the crowd and absolutely stunning the new president. Maribel is left so speechless by Sam's speech that he doesn't even get up to talk at his own inaugural address that followed Sam Houston's farewell address. If it wasn't for the rule that was in the Constitution, Houston probably would have ran for his second term and won right away. While Houston retired from the role of president, he remained restless. In 1839, Sam founded a new law practice, this time in Texas. He was also a founding member of the Sabine City Land Development Company, where he and the owners tried to build up Sabine City from a town to a true city. In 1839, only a year after his 2-year stint as president, Houston would run for another Texan government seat. This time, he ran for the House of Representatives for San Augustine County, easily winning this election. Houston spent the rest of his time watching the ticking clock that would eventually see the end of Maribel Lamar's disastrous presidency. Houston was not a fan of most of the things that Lamar stood for. Maribel Lamar even started what can only be described as a genocide against the Native Americans that Sam Houston had always had a soft spot for. After defeating David G. Burnett by 4,000 votes, Sam was handed back the country that he had helped to found and seen delve into around $7 million of debt under President Lamar. Sam Houston reenacted many of the same policies that he had once had in his first term. This included friendly relations with the Native Americans, cutting government expenses, especially in the military, as well as trying to get the USA to annex Texas. For his Secretary of State, Sam chose a man that was very much like himself in political thinking. His name was Anson Jones, and he will become very important in a few years. Upon becoming president, Houston almost immediately set up a meeting between him and the Native American tribes in Texas. This meeting re-established good relations, and the result would promote free trade and coexistence with the natives, much to the dislike of many Texans. One expense that Houston could easily cut out of the equation of Texan finance was the newly built Navy that Lamar had funded. The newly employed sailors did not want to lose their boats because they wanted to keep their job, so they did something quite comical to avoid the disbanding of their ship. The crew, under Captain Edwin Moore, decided to stay at sea so President Houston could never disband them. Houston wasn't a person that you wanted to avoid, as Edwin Moore and the rest of his crew were all declared as pirates. Not wanting to be a fugitive on the open sea, the crew decided to return to their Texan harbor at Galveston. President Sam arrived to disband the ships, but the people of Galveston rejected this. They saw how much Edwin Moore and his crew wanted their jobs, so they refused Sam Houston when he wanted to sell the boats. Reluctantly, Houston gave in and decided to keep the Navy. Just another expense that the $8 million in-debt Texas just couldn't afford. During Houston's first term, he tried to create good relations between Texas and its mother country of Mexico. Lamar would ruin this with his Santa Fe expedition, and Mexico would notice. President Santa Anna was eager to reinvade Texas and get revenge on the rebels there. So in March of 1842, he ordered for an invasion of southern Texas, taking multiple cities and going as far north as San Antonio. The Mexican army seemed to be trying to reclaim lost land from Texas, but this wouldn't stop Houston from reacting. Fearing that an attack on the Texan capital of Austin was imminent, Sam decided that it was due time to move the archives of Texas. All the history of the fledgling Texas nation was kept in Austin, including the Declaration of Independence as well as the Texan Constitution. Houston sent the Texan Rangers to evacuate these prized papers. No one cared enough to notify the citizens of Austin, though, who promptly shot at what they thought to be traitors. Not wanting to escalate the situation, the Rangers ran away from the Austin citizens, who ended up keeping the archives of Texas. The Mexican army that had invaded southern Texas was still on the loose, and needed to be dealt with promptly. 220 Texan Rangers were sent out to deal with this. Being outnumbered by the Mexican army 7 times over was a scary prospect. This prospect was made even scarier when a band of 200 Cherokee warriors joined the now reinforced Mexican army. The Mexicans held a fortified position in a nearby town, and obviously held the advantage. It was time for some Texan trickery to be orchestrated for a decisive victory. John Coffee Hayes was chosen to lure the Mexican army into an ambush where the 200 Texan Rangers waited. John Coffee Hayes was given 37 men for this task, which he succeeded in. The Mexican army is caught off guard, and the rout would begin. The running Mexican army would take 60 casualties as the Rangers would only see the death of 1 man, with only 9 being wounded. The Battle of Salado Creek would be the final and most decisive Texan victory of this newly ignited Texican-Mexican War. But the Texans weren't done, as Sam Houston ordered for the Muir expedition to kick out the remaining Mexican soldiers from southern Texas. The expedition was successful, considering the fact that they found no evidence of Mexican soldiers in Texan lands. This would not do for the Rangers, who now planned to return home with no heroic story to tell. That wouldn't do. No. They needed a story. So they crossed the Rio Grande River and set off to fight the Mexican army. Overconfidence is the death of many military expeditions, and this one would be no different. A battle would ensue that would see the outnumbered Rangers fight bravely until they became hungry and thirsty from a day's worth of battling. The Texans decided to surrender. President Santa Anna then ordered for the execution of the Texans, but a compromise would be made, and only 1/10 of the Texan soldiers would be executed. This was decimation to the definition, and the 10th man in every group was picked by a black bean. The 176 Texans were blindfolded and presented with a jar full of supposedly black and white beans. White beans meant life, and black beans, well, that was death. 17 Texans drew black beans and were executed, many of them being high-ranking officers, suggesting foul play. The rest of the 159 soldiers were sent to a prison in Mexico City, most likely joining their Santa Fe expedition brethren. The ultimate goal of Sam Houston's second term would be for protection from Mexico by joining with the United States. Their current president was a man named John Tyler, who considered the Texas annexation as his administrative priority. In April of 1844, a few months before the end of Houston and Tyler's presidencies, an official annexation treaty would be signed. It looked like his mission of annexation was complete, until 4 months later in June, where the U.S. Congress rejected the prospect of annexation, due to Texas being a slave state. The life goal of Sam Houston was very nearly in grasp. Surely, Texas would become a state soon. A land-hungry candidate that wanted Texas to be annexed ran, and won the 1844 American presidential election. His name was James K. Polk. The 1844 Texan presidential election would also take place, and the successors of Houston wouldn't kill themselves this time, as the 4th president of Texas, Anson Jones, would move from his position of Secretary of State to president on December 9th of 1844. Houston would end his term with Texas being $12 million in debt, but this is a decrease from the rate of debt that had been incurred under Lamar. Sam Houston, the guy that did so much with his life that I had to make 3 separate videos on him to capture his whole life. The year is 1846, and Texas has just gotten annexed to the United States of America. Houston's life work was finally complete, but he has much more to do. Just because Texas wasn't its own country anymore didn't mean that it didn't need people to represent this new state. And who better to represent the new state of Texas than the 2-time president, George Washington of Texas, Sam Houston. What role would he serve in this new government? Would he be a governor? A mayor? No, in 1846, Sam would become one of the 2 U.S. senators representing Texas. The other senator was another founding father of Texas, Thomas Rusk. Texas never had political parties so divided along party lines. Instead, there was a saying, and it goes like this. In the Republic of Texas, there was no political parties, just big personalities. Well, now the Republic of Texas was no more, so political parties would need to be decided upon. The big personality Sam Houston chose to rejoin with his old Democratic political party. When he became a senator, he became the only person to become the head of a former country and be a part of the United States Congress. There was something of an unwritten rule in the Senate. This rule stipulated that the new senators were to stay mostly silent unless told to talk. Houston, unsurprisingly, wasn't a fan of this hazing. So Houston stood up to address the Senate and spoke about the ongoing Oregon country problem that had involved land disputes between Great Britain and America in the Oregon and Washington state area. Houston was strongly for the annexation of this new land. I can only imagine that the well-respected Houston gained even more respect for standing up. The annexation of Texas left Mexico feeling threatened by the U.S., and the U.S. would respond with force. Mexico claimed that the Nueces River was the border between Texas and Mexico, while America claimed that the border was on the Rio Grande River. Neither side would concede to the other, and war would break out in 1846, in direct correlation with the annexation of Texas. The fighting was harsh in the north under General Zachary Taylor, who would soon become a president. But ultimately, the war was ended when General Winfield Scott landed in Veracruz, Mexico, and then marched into the capital city of Mexico City. The end of the Mexican-American War would see America take even more land from Mexico, with almost nothing but a little bit of money in return. It can be argued that Sam Houston caused this war, or more specifically, that the former Republic of Texas caused it. The one part of the Democratic Party that Sam Houston doesn't agree with is probably the most important issue: slavery. In 1848, unlike most of his Democratic colleagues, Sam voted on the Oregon Bill, which would make all of the newly acquired Oregon Territory non-slave states. Knowing that being anti-slavery in the Democratic Party would get him nowhere, Sam decided to shift his abolitionist standpoint to a more compromising view. In 1850, he supported the compromise that was presented by Henry Clay. This act would see California and Washington, D.C. become non-slave states, but it would also give slave bounty hunters more leeway as they chased and kidnapped runaway slaves and normal innocent black people as well. The term for United States senators is a long 6 years, meaning that Houston would need to run for re-election in 1852. But he had other ideas for this year's election. Sam Houston wanted to become president of the United States. He already had done it before, why not do it in his home country? Unfortunately for him, and America, the Democratic nominee for 1852 would be Millard Fillmore, who would win the election to become president. So Sam just ran for senator of Texas again, and ultimately won another 6 years of re-election. A few years later in 1854 would see Houston vote on another bill in regards to slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Houston would vote against this act, not because of slavery, but he didn't want Native Americans to lose any more of the little land that they still held on to. Houston agreed with almost nothing that the Democratic Party stood for anymore, so he joined a new political party. In 1855, Houston joined the Know Nothing Party, which was called this because if someone asked you what political party you were in, you replied with, "I know nothing." Houston joined this party because out of all the other political parties, the Know Nothing sought to help Native Americans the most. This party was also anti-immigration and wanted the citizenship of immigrants to be pushed back to 21 years instead of 5. 1856 would see another presidential election in which Houston hoped to run for again. But at the first Know Nothing National Convention, Houston was once again looked over for Millard Fillmore, who won the Know Nothing vote but lost the presidency to James Buchanan. After this, Houston gave up on political parties. His liberal ideas were just too much for America to handle at this moment in time. In 1857, Houston ran for the governorship of the state that he had largely created, Texas. With no political parties to back him, he lost to the Democratic nomination of Hardin Runnels. This was the only electoral defeat of Houston's entire political career. Texas had started to turn against Sam, as they called for him to resign early as senator, but he denied and served his term until 1859, marking 13 years of senatorial service. The end of his senatorial tenure left Houston with just enough time to run for the governorship of Texas once again. Under Governor Runnels, Texas had been suffering heavily from Comanche raids. This would lead to the notoriously pro-Indian Sam Houston winning the governorship of Texas. And with this win, Houston became the only person in American history to become the governor of 2 separate states. 1859 and the following years were probably the worst time to be governor for any state, and especially a southern one, because in 1860, Abraham Lincoln would win the presidential election on an anti-slavery ticket. If Lincoln won, the southern states vowed to secede from the Union. Houston tried to prevent this in Texas by running a pro-Union campaign across the state just before the election took place. In 1860 and 1861, several states seceded from the Union to create the Confederate States of America. And on February 1st of 1861, the question would be presented to Texas at a statewide convention. Sam knew that the pro-slavery Texas would secede from the Union, but if Sam could just control how, then he could prevent the deaths of many Texans in this upcoming war. So at this convention, Houston declared the return of the Republic of Texas. Unfortunately, Houston got little support for the new Republic of Texas, and he was removed from the seat of governor by the Confederates on March 18th, 1861. This civil war would end the career of one of the most influential Americans in history. Sam would retire after this, and spend the rest of his days in his house. The house that he lived in is modeled to look like a steamboat. It is located in Huntsville, Texas, and can still be visited to this day. At the age of 70, on July 26 of 1863, Samuel Houston would pass away, in the midst of the deadliest war in American history. Sam Houston is often forgotten when talking about American history. His impact is always seen as just the guy who made Texas, but he's much more than that. In a time of intense hatred for natives, he was one of them. In a time where slavery was normal in the South, he opposed it. And in a time when most Americans solely went with the beliefs of their political party, Sam found his own beliefs, grounded in what he believed in.